So it is my great honor to introduce Nazirahk Amen, who's here with us today as our keynote speaker. He is a homeopath and naturopathic physician and oriental medicine practitioner in the Washington, D.C. metro area. And in addition to a very busy medical practice, he manages about 20 acres of grains, beans, and vegetable production around the area. He's the owner of Purple Mountain Organics, which offers fine tools, growing supplies, and sustainable ag services. And today, Dr. Amen will discuss the solutions that sustainable, locally grown, nutrient-dense foods can offer for many of the diet-related medical diseases in the United States. And he sees that this new farming paradigm that's emerging that embraces improved soil biology and healthy microbiomes is at the foundation for these nutrient-dense foods that enhance human health. When farmers embrace these biological farming models, they become part of the healing network, this vast healing network, for both humans and the planet. So, Nazirahk, I'm so looking forward to learning with you today. Thank you for the journey, and I will hand it over. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Peace to you all. Thank you for having me. It's a great honor. I've never been a keynote speaker anywhere before, so thank you for the opportunity. This is a picture here of my daughter, and I want to point out this area right here. And so, I think it's part of what's missing in healthcare now, because right there she has a relationship both with the food that she's growing and the soil that it was grown in. So this is my beautiful daughter. She's blossomed into a really beautiful being. She's 19 now, and she really loves flowers. She still helps us out on the farm. And so the operation that we run is a family-based operation, both in my medical practice and the farming that we do. So I want to start off, you can see that, let's see how this works again. Here we go. So that's me right there. And that's probably around 1972 or 3. So you can see I've been at this farming thing for quite a while. And I look pretty happy in that picture. So I was born in Louisiana, raised in Louisiana. My father was a really hard-working man. He was sort of a construction man who we grew up in town, and my parents really strived to help us get back to the land from living in the town that we grew up in. And so one of the most influential things in my life from my father was probably about this time. He quit a job that he had been working for years. He ran a construction business, I guess the operations part of a construction business, and the owner of the business had some equipment for sale. And my father wanted to buy that equipment, and at that point, the owner was like, if you have extra time on your hands, you can come and work for me on the weekend. And so my father saw that his growth there was limited, and he branched off on his own. And so I lived in the shadow, both myself and my brother, of this man who had a dream, and he put it into action. And I think the entrepreneurial spirit that I got from him, you can't get out of books. And so I thank him for that. So I want to fast forward to now. So I'm a naturopathic doctor and an acupuncturist. I have an undergraduate degree in biology, but I really started off most of my degree in chemistry, and I switched over to biology towards the end. And so with that, I also have I went to a school called Bastyr in Seattle. So let me back up just a little bit. So while I did my undergraduate degree, I worked as a medic, as an intermediate level EMT for the city of New Orleans for about 4 years. So my first medical training came through that experience, and it was within the conventional medical system. And so I got a lot of training and experience from that. You know, I tell people, like, when I was in naturopathic school, my colleagues used to get really, you know, they really wanted to learn everything that was in books that we had to offer, and some of them were a little perturbed that I didn't seem to put as much energy into that as they did. But I would tell them, you know, if the patient walks in your office and they can talk to you, then, you know, at that point, you just have to be with them and talk to them, and you can figure out what's really going on with them. And it's not about how much we know, you know, as a doctor, in terms of impressing people with information. I think when you meet people heart to heart, you can help people work through the worst situations. And so for my colleagues, it was really, you know, this need to know, this need to learn. I mean, I have it, but I also understand that if we're present with people, we can help a healing unfold. And I had seen people do all kinds of crazy stuff to each other, so I figured, you know, they walked in, you know. They didn't have a knife from ear to ear. They didn't have a gunshot wound. They weren't in the middle of an asthma attack or some other medical crisis. So in my practice, you know, we try to really treat the whole person. So I use these items here, the naturopathic medicine, the acupuncture, the Chinese herbs, the homeopathy, the nutrition. All of these things are tools in our tool chest that we use to help patients. And the foundation of what we do is really related to food. I think that healing is about helping people discover their purpose and removing the obstacles to living that. And at the same time, there's a core level of nutrition that we need to sort of carry that out. So people ask me all the time, you know, so I have to say I met a couple people from Kentucky. I've been knowing Joel from Earth Tools for quite a while. So in my practice, you know, for a while I was really trying to, part of our family life has been to grow as much of our own food as we could, right? And so I was at a homeopathic conference in Brattleboro, Vermont. I was there, I bought some DeWitt tools at a store, and I was like, wow, these tools are great. And so I ended up buying a whole bunch of these tools. And I had these tools kind of sitting in my office, and it was, in a way, weird. You know, I remember one day this young lady walking in with her father, and so you're coming into a medical office, and I had a sort of a bookstore in the front, and then I had another room on the side with all these tools in it, and I practiced sort of in the back. And I heard the door open, and I heard this thing, Daddy, this is spooky. What's all these tools doing in a doctor's office? What's going on here? And so just in the back of my mind, I was like, if you only understood what these tools really mean for human health. So why would a doctor want anything to do with farming? You know, what does food really have to do with healing? And why would a doctor encourage their patient to cultivate direct relationships with the foods that they consume? So this is one of our fields. This is a new plot that we have. This is our rice production for 2022. That's about an acre of rice that you see there. We do a dryland rice production. In that field, there's about 5 or 6 different varieties of rice that we do. And so this new plot that we're using here, there's some sandy soil. And it was beautiful if you look around the borders of the field here, we had just put in a fence and cleared everything to get it into production. So that's been a beautiful journey. So Purple Mountain Grown, so we do there's 10 acres at that farm. I'll show you some other farms that we work in, but in about 3 different sites, we work about 20 acres of land. So we're in a couple farmers markets locally. There's a farmers market in Tacoma Park, Maryland. That's a really good farmers market on Sunday that we're in all year. In the summertime, we do grains, beans, but we also do specialty crops, vegetables. And so in our grain lineup, we do everything from dry beans, hard wheat, soft wheats, einkorn, barley, cornmeal, corn grits, popcorn, oatmeal. We do the rice, of course, buckwheat. We experiment with as many grains as we can and getting them to the table. Along with that, we do the vegetables. In the summertime, we like to grow a lot of melons. But we do contract farming. So COVID has made it, so I guess give you a window into my life. Basically, I practice medicine on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. Sometimes an extra half day, but those days are full days in the office seeing patients. And then we farm all the other moments outside of that. As you all know, farming is not sort of a weekend venture. Farming dictates what happens for us in a lot of cases in terms of what's happening in the field and taking care of plants. And so this is my crew, along with my daughter. This is us in front of a cover crop this year. So just an idea of, I wrote in the bio about being a peri-urban farmer. This is a map of around the DC area. So in the middle of this is the belly of the beast, Washington, DC. And so we're in Tacoma Park, which is right in the DC Beltway. One of the farms that we farm is a little bit north of there, which is in Sandy Spring, Maryland. And then we farm at a university right in Beltsville, Maryland. Our new farm is about 30 miles away from us, over in a place called Upper Marlboro. And if we go all the way down to the bottom is where my friend's farm is, and this is where we do all the processing of the grains. So in our operation, I do a lot of traveling. We do a lot of sort of logistics and moving stuff around, equipment around, and we do what's necessary to really get it done. All right, so what are these folk? Does anybody know who these people are? So on the right there, we have Rockefeller, and on the left, we have J.P. Morgan. So what do these folk have in common with these folk? They're both rich. They're definitely barons. And I would say that they all have sort of extra influence on the way things proceed in the lives of everyday ordinary people. So I want to go to really about at the turn of the 19th century. And if we go back into the 19th century, or at the turn of the 20th century, so around 1900, during the mid 1800s, medicine was interesting. We had about 131 medical schools that were in operation, and they taught everything from herbology to colon therapy, hydrotherapy, water cure. You had the conventional doctors back then who really mainly practiced bloodletting. So, there's a huge sale in leeches. Like millions of leeches were grown and used in medicine. Not many people know, but George Washington actually, he died when he came down with a flu or something, and they actually bloodlet him, and then he actually became too anemic because they took too many pints of blood away from him, and that's how he left. But the conventional doctors back then practiced bloodletting. They used items like arsenic, like mercury, other heavy metals, lead, to really try to cure and treat diseases. And so out of Kentucky, actually, you had an interesting figure who was John Harvey Kellogg, who was born in Kentucky. And he was actually sent to school by Ellen White and the Seventh-day Adventist. And he ended up in Battle Creek, Michigan, which I think is about a couple hundred miles directly north of here. And he ran one of the most successful sort of natural medicine healing centers in the U.S. But the scene back then was, and out of Kellogg's, we know Kellogg's, the cereals, right? So there was this introduction into sort of whole foods. So you had Kellogg's, you had Graham of Graham Crackers. One of the biggest investors in Kellogg's was C.W. Post, which became Post Cereal. So all of these people sort of were at the foundation of what we know as sort of the natural foods movement back in the 19th century. So there's another gentleman who was born in Louisville, or he actually was an educator in Louisville. So Flexner, there were two Flexners. This is Abraham Flexner, and Abraham Flexner's brother was the president of the Rockefeller Institute, which was founded in 1901. And so he was a medical doctor, and the Rockefeller Institute was founded to sort of advance medicine and, I guess in whatever humanitarian way or looking out for people. Maybe he meant well, but what he did was Flexner got Rockefeller got his buddy J.P. Morgan. So Flexner's brother, the doctor, ran the Rockefeller Institute. Rockefeller got J.P. Morgan to hire Abraham Flexner, who was an educator in Louisville, right? And so he became a researcher, and he came up with this report called the Flexner Report, which was published in 1910. And what the Flexner Report did was sort of come up with a standardization for medical schools in the U.S. And so the ideal medical school was the one that his brother had gone to, which was Johns Hopkins. One of his main instructors was a German physician. And basically what they were able to do was sort of set the guidelines for what we understand as the medical school system that we have. So I think there was like 131 medical schools. He narrowed that down to about 50 medical schools. And basically Rockefeller, they incentivized it by funding schools based on them adapting the principles, these sort of scientific principles that Abraham Flexner had come up with. So what this effectively did was close down most of the alternative medical schools. And let me say this. So I'm also a homeopath. Homeopathy during the 19th century was one of the medicines that really saved a lot of people. I think there was like 200 homeopathic hospitals in the U.S. At the end of the century. And so many of these things sort of were abandoned, and Flexner had effectively done a medical coup. And so I want to draw some parallels between what happened in natural medicine, or with natural medicine, and what happened in farming. And so basically, conventional medicine relies on an understanding of anatomy, physiology, biology, and chemistry. These are all the basic courses that we take as doctors. We get a good understanding of pathology, which is the disease process. And we learn how to identify diseases and become competent diagnosticians. Diseases are treated and eliminated, and usually we're using pharmaceuticals, surgeries, and these types of medical interventions, and the standard is maintained through research. And in general, most times normal human nutrition is not a primary consideration in considering pathologies, right? So, and in many of the languages that we hear the war on cancer, we hear the war on different diseases, and so we have this sort of ideology. So my sister is a pharmacist, and I was visiting her over the Christmas break, and she was doing some work, and I asked her what she was doing, and so her job is to help businesses save on their healthcare costs. And so what she showed me here, and what this graph shows, is that in America, you have your retail sort of traditional therapeutic drugs, which are what we know as retail pharmacy. So the spending, 98% of the health, 99% of the drugs that we get come through this avenue. And of those drugs, 40% of the healthcare spending right now is related to this sort of top line, which is diabetes, so metabolic diseases, right? And so that represents about 50% of the spending, and 40% of that 50% goes on diabetes drugs. So in the other 1% category, which represents the other 50% of spending, is all this new class of drugs, and the primary category here is the anti-inflammatories, right? So I'm pointing this out to point out that two of the main categories that's going on with what's wrong with Americans has to do with metabolic syndrome and with inflammation, right? And so we have to think about how our food supply is contributing to these illnesses, okay? And I would add to this that we're also in the middle of sort of a fertility or infertility epidemic that kind of goes along with this. So in the American healthcare system, how did we fare after 100 years of conventional medicine? So America is number one in healthcare spending. We're number 11, according to the Commonwealth Fund, among healthcare in high-income nations in 2022. Back in 2000, the World Health Organization ranked us as number 37 in terms of quality of health care. And what we have is a system that does really well with certain diseases, with surgery, with emergency medicine, and does terrible with chronic diseases. And I think a large part of that is that we're not recognizing where these diseases are coming from. And also in this system, we have every year, and this is, the numbers can be higher depending on the source, but this was actually from a doctor who looked at all of the sources and came up with what he considered to be a fair number. So every year we have about 100,000 Americans who die from adverse effects of medical treatment, which is basically from interacting with the medical system. So at the end of Flexner's life, he sort of lamented that science, in the very act of solving problems, creates more, right? So at the heart of this is this sort of kind of, I don't know, it's a reductionistic, linear thinking that sees things in terms of, just the line. And I think if we look at, in many ways, kind of like a pharmaceutical commercial, right? You get this great drug, and they sort of line you up like, do you have this problem? Do you have this problem? Well, check this drug out, right? And then at the end of the commercial, it's like, it can create this illness, this side effect, that side effect, and then it goes on, and then, and I was asking my sister, like, do people really go for this? And she says yes. She's like, people go to their doctors and demand drugs based on these commercials, right? And so it's very interesting how this is all played out. But it's clear that it's the result of a very reductionistic, linear thought pattern, right? And so, all right, now I want to turn to agriculture. So my farm colleague in Sandy Spring, Maryland, right? He gave a presentation, and his grandfather, his great-grandfather, so Tom is a Quaker, and he spent most of his life starting Quaker schools around the world and running Quaker schools. And so he moved back to Sandy Spring, Maryland, to the family land, and most of that land is now owned by, and how can I say that? And by Ali, who is an immigrant from Iran. And so, but Tom knows the history of the land. So he was telling me just a couple weeks ago, he did this presentation, but a couple months ago, he was telling me about the history of the land. So his great-great-grandfather was a slave owner, and he said that in the beginning, in the 1700s, the locals, so you had your sort of industrial agriculture model, but he said a lot of the people had discovered the Three Sisters system, and this was the system that kind of helped soil health up, and a lot of people actually were able to make it. But by the middle of the 18th century, around the Quakers in this area actually freed their slaves in 1815. And so, but you had tobacco, which was the main crop in the area that was growing. And the tobacco growers, basically, what they were able to do was exhaust all the soils, right? So the first production of nitrogen that came in actually came in the middle of the 18th century. So this is the great guano heap off the coast of South America, of Peru and Chile, around 1865. So when they found this, they actually thought that there would be this endless supply of guano, and, it would fertilize soils for a long time. So this shows, like in 1850, how many tons of this stuff was sort of imported into the U.S. and how much was done by 1861. By the end of the 18th century, they had exhausted all those supplies. So Tom was telling me about the C&O Canal, which is a system of canals that comes inland. So all along the East Coast, we had exhausted the lands, and people started to migrate to the west to get better land. And so along with that migration was sort of the Western movement of fertilizers that came. So what's my time like? Okay. So in 1900 or 1909, I want to fast forward a bit to 1909 when you have these two gentlemen, Haber and Bosch. Haber and Bosch came up with a reaction known as the Haber-Bosch reaction. And in the Haber-Bosch reaction, they were able to create nitrogen from the atmosphere. So they were able to derive ammonia from atmospheric nitrogen. And so basically from that, we have the advent, along with the introduction of phosphorus, of the system that we know now, which is conventional farming, which is the beginning of the Green Revolution, right? So in this chart shows that, I guess the downside is that we're producing all this nitrogen, which makes plants grow really fast. But only half of it gets to the plants. So this is the beginning of soluble nutrients. So we boast about how many people in the world that we feed. We've had a population boom along with the advent of these chemicals. And now, 100 years later, we're seeing all of the destruction that has come from these farming methods. And again, if you look at conventional farming, they rely on an understanding of anatomy, physiology, biology, and chemistry using scientific methods. They rely on pathology and an understanding of plant diseases. They look at diseases as sort of an enemy that needs to be eliminated. And they also rely on, the latest research and the use of chemicals, mainly as the treatments that they use. So these are the big fields. So again, the end of that is soil degradation, destruction of soil biology, soil demineralization, which means macro and micronutrient deficiencies. We see genetic disturbances, which we have yet to know what any of that is going to mean for the future, with some of the crops that are being created and how they interact with the plants that are there. We see increased resistance to herbicides and pesticides among weeds and different bug pests. And then we have the extractionary practices that resources will eventually run out. I just saw that they have come to, there's one last store of phosphorus somewhere in the Sahara in Africa. And so they're trying to figure out how they're going to distribute this phosphorus. Because the poor nations are saying, hey, we need phosphorus, and if this is the end of phosphorus, how are we going to fairly distribute the phosphorus? And so in the midst of all of this, between nitrogen and phosphorus, we have, the Chesapeake Bay, the Gulf of Mexico, basically the poisoning of our environment. And all of we can talk about environmental injustices all around the world, but a lot of this has to do with the use of chemicals. And so in the end, to go back to the second slide, which is Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, this is part of their vision for the future, which is how to grow food on Mars. And so I think that, we're Earth beings, and we're in Earth bodies, and we're meant to live an earthly existence. And so in a way, I firmly reject the thought of this. So I want to come to what I do and some basic principles. You know, I walked in the building, and the first thing I saw was Jesse's book. And the first chapter in his book says, disturb as little as possible. And so the first principle of naturopathic medicine is, first, do no harm. To use the least invasive and least toxic and most natural methods in helping people. To identify and treat the causes, so not just look at the symptoms, but also to look at the underlying causes around why someone might be ill. The inherent belief in the healing power of nature and of the human body. I think if I have one complaint, I really think that there shouldn't be conventional medicine and natural medicine. I think there should only be medicine. I think conventional medicine has a lot of good to offer, and I think natural medicine has a lot of good to offer. And when patients come in, and sometimes people come to me and they feel torn, like, I'm doing this natural approach, but what about the conventional approach? And so what I try to do is educate people as to what their options are. And in educating people, if you have a tumor, you may have to cut it out, and then you can change your lifestyle. And we go from there. You may have to go through some chemotherapy, and we can help detoxify you from the poison that you've gone through. But to rely solely on natural medicine to get over what you have at this point may be a stretch, right? So I try to help meet people and help them be practical about what natural medicine can actually do for them. And so in that is educating patients and providing them with the choices that they have. I do have cancer patients who have decided within themselves that they only want to do natural medicine. And so many of them have survived. Many of them have learned to live with cancer. And so I think that's a choice that people have. And so I'm going to speed up a little bit because I got a lot of slides I want to get through here. So we have here natural medicine, and then this is like organics, right? And then I got a friend of mine, Elliot Coleman. He talks about deep organics, right? And in deep organics, this is more what we're coming to in terms of biological farming. And so, but the core principle of this is as above, so below, which means that the same dynamics that order the universe are at work in the human body. We are essentially walking solar systems. We just need to realize it. And so health is a natural state of humanity. Disease is an adaptive response to the disturbances in the field. The correction of the disturbance should result in the restoration of health. All right? And so the interventions should involve the least necessary force, and extreme circumstances can require conventional intervention, and we need to know our limitations in that. So I want to point out this man is the founder of homeopathy. He is the only medical doctor. This is a picture of a monument erected to him in downtown D.C. He is the only medical doctor that has a monument in downtown D.C. And homeopathy right now is under attack fully by conventional medicine. Homeopathic medicines are the only medicines that are treated as drugs and regulated by the FDA. Herbs and supplements do not fall under the FDA regulation, but homeopathic medicines do. And it's very interesting that he has this monument in the middle of D.C. And so the core, I want to speed up here because I got about 15 minutes left. The core, so we view disease as a posture, right? So if you or I leave here today and we decide we're going to go on a safari and we go out to a jungle and we get ourselves in a tangle with a lion, probably the best thing to do is this, right? Run. And so let's say we come back to whatever town or city we live in, and maybe it's a couple weeks later and we decide to go out on a walk, and the neighbor's dog comes running up on us, and the next thing we know, we find ourselves up in a tree somewhere, right? And the neighbor's like, hey, what are you doing in my tree, right? And so the first thing we're going to do is be like, oh, you know, I'm sorry, I'm tripping, right? I was in the jungle last week, and this crazy thing happened to me, and I was chased by this lion, and, you know, I didn't know what just happened to me, right? And so, but maybe another 6 months or so goes by, and, you know, you're at work, and the boss starts yelling at you or yelling at somebody, and you have that same response on the inside, right? And so, but you know, I'm at work, I can't run, but that's the response that you have. And so maybe you go home and you start arguing with your spouse, and then you have that same response, right? And so this energy has become entrained in us. This incident left a mark, which is sort of a maladaptive response. And healing is about coming back out of that, because our energy can't be in present time if we're stuck in something that happened in the past, or we're caught up in what might happen in the future. Health is about being present and being able to deal with whatever comes our way in the best way possible. So a while back, I had a case that I presented at a school, and the case was of sarcoid arthritis, right? This lady had worked for, she was a lawyer that worked for a utility company, and her job was basically, she was a human resources lawyer. And so about 10 years in, she started getting this severe arthritic condition that every time she got one of these outbreaks, it deformed whatever joint it attacked, right? And so it had really deformed most of her hands and her feet. And so it was a case of burning pain, wandering joint pain. So when I asked her what it really felt like and encouraged her to go into it, she said it felt like it was someone standing over. It's like if someone's there and they're beating someone else down and they're beating them to a pulp, right? And so this figurative statement that she had led me to understand that the dynamics involved was sort of the dynamics involved in a sort of domination subjugation, right? This one person was trying to dominate the other person. And so then you had the level of pathology. So the remedy I prescribed for her was formica rufa, which is the red ant, right? Red ant produces formic acid. Formic acid burns you. So in homeopathic, so this remedy cured this lady, right? She woke up the next day. For the first time ever, the joint pain was gone. She came to the firm conclusion the next day. She called me. She said, you know what? I got to quit my job. I've been on it for 19 years. I got one left to go, and I can't go in there for another moment. Because her job was to fire her colleagues, right? And so every time they gave her a chart, she would get this sort of feeling in her gut like, oh no, here I go. And so in that, she knew she had to shift her energy and do something different, right? And that was the source of her healing. So this lady, with this remedy, all of this joint pain went away. So I presented this case at a naturopathic school, and one of the students challenged me. And so I realized then the difference between sort of organic farming and deep organics. Like, he didn't understand what had happened here. He said, you paid this lady. So I presented it as a video case. So we had the patient there, my questioning, and then it showed both before and after. He said, you paid this lady, she probably actually did, prednisone or something, and you're not telling us the full story. So I realized at that point he didn't believe, right, in the medicine that he was about to practice. And so Dr. Bastyr, I went to Bastyr University, which is a 4-year naturopathic school in Seattle. Dr. Bastyr, at the end of his career, he said, Bastyr is known as the school that gets natural medicine into the mainstream. And so he said, keep on with your scientific research, but don't lose the philosophy. So my idea is that these double-blind studies with treatments and controls that we do in both medicine and in farming need to be shifted over to outcomes-based studies that really have to do with what the end results are. So the randomized controlled trials measures efficacy, and the evidence-based stuff measures effectiveness, right? So I'm going to fast forward, but at the core of what I believe is that we're spiritual beings. At the center of this circle is our source, is our authentication, and we live our lives on the edge of this circle. This is known as sort of the circumpunct, right? And so we get caught up in duality. So I'm going to go pretty fast. How much time do I have? Okay. So this is the flower of life, which is a symbol based on a circle. I'm going to go through this real fast. So here we have the Fibonacci sequence, which is based on the same principle of as above, so below. In this, you have a formula where 1 + 2 = 3, 2 + 3 = 5. So this is a dimension that's found everywhere in nature. So here we have an artichoke, we have a flower, another flower. This is a solar system. This is a storm. This is a coral. It's a human fingerprint. This is a bacteria. This is another bacteria. This is a colony of bacteria. Colony of bacteria. This is a virus. This is coronavirus. And this is algae. This is a cross-section of DNA. And this is us in our cosmic form. So one of my professors taught me that we need a system. I'm going to go past all of this because I want to talk about yin and yang as duality. So my idea is that healing is about transforming our lives from a dualistic state into a non-dualistic state. It's about bringing our being, which is non-dualism, into our doing, right? Which is a very dualistic venture. It's engaging with the world, and the world is full of duality. So in the world, what I mean by that, let me back up a bit, is we have this concept of yin and yang, and it represents a balance in duality. What I was going to say about Dr. Modell was like, he taught us physiology, but he taught it from a perspective that you need to understand things from a systems point of view. You need to understand the whole and how the whole operates. And so then we move on to Chinese medicine, where we have this symbol, which is the Taoist symbol, which pits yin and yang. Yin and yang are the opposites, so night and day, summer and winter, growth and decay, energy and matter, chemistry and biology, masculine and feminine, heaven and earth. And so I need to fast forward here because I want to point out, so there's a whole system, and in this system, you see the elements. So where do we get our energy from? We get our energy from 3 places. So the beginning energy that we come here with is our seed energy, it's our parental energy, it's our genetics. That energy interacts with our living conditions and our food, and this is the environmental energy that we get. And the other source of energy is when we connect our heart and our mind and we live in our purpose. And I guess from a biblical point of view, when we're able to live in a way that we allow grace into our lives, when we allow ourselves to be in the moment and that energy, that connection to the source comes through our lives in the present moment. That's really the only replenishable source of chi that we have, because we get energized from what we do instead of getting drained by it, right? So life is about the art of being and becoming. I need to fast forward a bit. So in this dynamic of the elements and how the elements move through their cycles, we have wood, which is the spring. We have fire, which is the summer. We have earth, which is the late summer. We have metal, which is the autumn. And we have water, which is the winter. And so what I want to note is that in the winter, we have this thing that we don't have in our day-to-day life, which is the concept of rebirth, right? All of us walk around and we're really afraid of death. That's the biggest fear that most of us have. And as we see the cycles in nature, as we watch our plants, as we move from season to season, there is rebirth. And so a lot of what I do in medicine is helping people to gain faith and to understand that there is rebirth, right? And so I also want to point out on this graph that all of these elements have flavors. Have taste: sour, bitter, sort of sweet, pungent, and salty. Sour astringes, bitter drains, sweet nourishes, pungent disperses, and salty dissolves. And so in that, I want to relate that directly to the way that phytochemicals affect us in our bodies. We'll pass through this. So this is magnesium in a chlorophyll, and this is iron in a heme. So this is a plant versus a human. So I want to go to rhizophagy. Rhizophagy was done, and so in rhizophagy, what we figured out is that plants have the ability to actually take in bacteria from the soil, get the nutrients that they need in their root zone. Okay, and just 1 minute, please. So get the nutrients they need in their root zone and digest in the same way that we digest in our colon, right? And so there's a lining, and the plants also have the ability to take the nutrients from those bacteria and send them back out into nature and tell them what they actually need through the mucus lining. And the mucus lining in our gut is a direct reflection of what's happening in the soil. And so our large intestine and the root system of a plant have so much in common. The microbiome, it encompasses about 43% of who we are. I just want to point out a couple more things and then we can stop. So in America right now, we are suffering from this diabetes crisis, and part of it is that we're constantly secreting insulin. Insulin is the hormone that comes and it builds up sugar. It is the hormone of the obesity epidemic. And part of what I do in my practice is help people get to the point where they can actually experience the hormone, which is the opposite of insulin, which is glucagon. And glucagon is the hormone that is responsible for breaking down fat. You have to basically not eat for a few hours in order to experience glucagon. At first, we live off of glycogen, which is sort of a built-up starch. And then down after glycogen, we go into what's called autophagy, which is where we start to actually live off of break down fat and live off of the nutrients that are there and do tissue repair. So this is just some quick pictures. So we get our microbiome straight from our mother. And there's a lot of environmental factors that, like C-sections, like chemicals, that can affect our patients, this microbiome. This is the microbiome in mother's milk. This is human milk. This is human baby feces. You see the microbiome there. The microbiome affects so many different parts of us from our skin. The biggest part of our microbiome is actually in the gut. The biggest part of our nervous system outside of the brain is in the gut. The microbiome and the gut-brain axis, where these microbiome control so many things in our bodies. And so this is the lining of the plant, which is very similar to what's happening in the rhizosphere. This shows leaky gut. This is actually bacteria in the brain. Couple more things I wanted to get to, which is omega-3 fatty acids and their role in inflammation, and the dearth of omega-3 fatty acids in our soils are that we're producing from our soil. So because plants can't use the rhizophagy system, and we're using these soluble nutrients of phosphorus and potassium, we're shutting down plants' ability to use rhizophagy. And so when we do that, we shut down the phytonutrient production, so we're producing more food with less nutrients. And we have to look at the role of these phytonutrients in human production and human disease. But the role of omega-3 fatty acids, we need to farm in ways that help us produce. So, I came up with a diagnosis of, how can I summarize? So we live in a society where we're over-consuming. And we're over-consuming food that doesn't have a lot of nutrients. And so our appetite never gets satiated, so we keep consuming. So that's the basis of our obesity epidemic, right? And what diabetes is that we lose the efficacy of our digestive system, and we kind of become waterlogged. And so it's very similar to what's happening with our fields and the way that we do agriculture. And so I'm not being very clear here, and I think my time is up. But you can ask me questions about this, and I'm willing to answer them. All right. Sorry, thank you. Yes.
What type of fertilization do you use in your crops? And second, do you do any perennial grains or legumes?
We use clover and different types of legume or nitrogen-fixing plants in our cover crop mixes. And
I'm thinking more the perennial, like the Land Institute's developed.
Yes, we love to. We have not figured out how we harvest them and continue their production with the equipment that we have. And so that's our dilemma, is how do we harvest and have that perennial continue on as a perennial and then harvest again. And so our fertilization is really moving more towards an understanding of rhizophagy and the mineralization of soils, and moving more towards Albright and the methods that he came up with to sort of establish more nutrient-dense foods. So, we just applied rock dust. We're looking at how to balance out the minerals in the soil so that everything is there, so that we do not have to use any external sources of nitrogen on our fields. And so the goal is to promote biology and have the faith in a system. My buddy Heinz, he farms. He hasn't used external sources of nitrogen on his land in maybe 20 years, and it's amazing to me the farming that he does, because I've been programmed into this NPK, and to breaking away from that thought pattern has taken a while, but I'm having more faith in that process. So we're shifting our system away from any forms of soluble nitrogen, no more Chilean nitrates, minimizing our use of nitrogen-based fertilizers, even organic ones, and shifting more towards the mineral balancing system. So, and I would say that in that process, we've switched more to doing foliar sprays of the nitrogens and the phosphorus when we need to, and instead of interrupting the rhizophagy cycle that's happening in the soil. Other questions? I saw a hand. Yes.
Well, I'm kind of loud. So you were saying that with your foliar sprays, doing those instead, have you noticed a difference in like your production-wise? Has it decreased, increased, remained the same?
Well, I think in the beginning we were experiencing somewhat of a, how can I say this? I had what I'm recognizing that is environment plays a big role. We grew one variety of wheat in two different places, right? So on our sandy soil with this one variety of wheat, we got a per acre yield of like 900 pounds. And then we have this other soil, which is part of the Piedmont in Sandy Spring, and we grew wheat on that land with no fertilization, and we ended up with a harvest of about 4,200 pounds per acre. And so I guess there's more to consider than just nitrogen and phosphorus on the one property, because that land is just in transition, and we don't know what they necessarily did before. And so I guess when we start with this method there, I don't know what else in the soil, what chemical remnants or that might be affecting not using fertilizers. And so we're seeing a drop in yield in the beginning, and we hope that as we put in the nutrients that will end the biology. And I'm learning even in transplanting that, we used to do these sort of dips when we transplant, and we'd use like a soluble nitrogen, a soluble phosphorus, and this idea that you get the root system going up front, right? So what we're doing now is we're stopping that. There's no more addition of soluble nutrients at the beginning, because what we do is inoculate with a multi-species inoculant of both bacteria and mycorrhiza. And so I think if you can inoculate your seed and put the seed in the soil, and you get this system to go from the beginning, so that you don't put your plants on drugs from the beginning, because if you start them off with these soluble nutrients from the beginning, how are they ever going to really develop that rhizophagy cycle in the way that they could to produce the maximum yields that we need to produce? And so I work with a university. I would love that, in some ways we could do some experimentation and different treatments with this to see the difference. But I'm pretty sure, from my understanding, is that if we start these plants off with the rhizophagy cycle, just inoculating them and leaving all the nutrients that should be in place there, that the plants have the ability to get the nutrients that they need and maximize the phytonutrients. You know, one of the experiments that we did in the beginning was an apple orchard, and it was almost a failure from the start, in that we put it in an apple orchard in a damp, wet spot, and apples love dry, not wet spots. So the water table was only about 18 inches. But we put a lot of energy into this system, and we were able to get some apples from it that not many people could appreciate. And now, like 10 years after we gave up that project, you know, we've come across a few people who are doing organic apples in our region, and their stuff is about as good as what we had. And, you know, there's this movement in Virginia, like, how to love ugly apples, you know, how to actually, what I'm trying to say is, when we measure, like, crop yield, so I think what we need to understand is that conventional farming is producing fat plants. And so when you put your organic plants, which are full of micronutrients and phytochemicals, next to an obese plant, it may be smaller, it may not look ideal, but it's more nutritious. And I think we need a way to measure nutrient density that would go beyond just appearances. All right.